The FIDE Candidates has begun, the event that decides the challenge for the world title. I'll try my best to make some daily recaps. In order to make that feasible, I'll make them a bit short and sweet, and I'll continue them if people like it. Okay, let's go. Okay, the first game we'll look at is Sindarov versus Esipenko. Sindarov with the white pieces. The game started with d4, d5, c4, e6. The standard Queen's Gambit declined. Here, bishop e7 gets played. Now, the old main line was bishop to g5. There are even some grandmasters that claim that this is just a draw, which is insane. Instead, we see c takes. We get the call spot structure anyway. First of all, we see white bringing the bishop out of the pawn chain before playing e3, and black goes immediately for c5. See bishop to d3, knight to c6, and short castles. Now, you might be thinking over here, white here has the opportunity to take on c5. This will settle black with what is known as an isolated queen's pawn. In this scenario, though, it's very easy to see that black has not a hard time getting rid of this weakness, because after the move castles, black can simply play the move d4, which immediately liquidates the position, and this should be a quite simple draw, as you can see by the huge draw rate. Instead, we see short castles. However, this allows for black to play the move c4. Lots of interesting things going on here. First of all, c4 releases tension in the middle. This will tell us that white should play for the pawn break e4. What black is doing is grabbing queenside space with gain of time, so an idea could be playing for b4, a5, b4. Black retreats, we want to stay on this diagonal, and here we see knight to h5. Now, this is of course a move that goes after the bishop, but it's also preparing for the mobility of the f-pawn, because white's main pawn break is and will always be e3 to e4. So by allowing the pawn to come forward, we are ramping down on this square. Here we see the bishop go back to e5, bishop to e6. They establish some tension on the queen side. The queen goes to a5, the knight is hit, so the knight moves. The move pawn b5 gets played, and the knight goes to f4. Interesting moment happens here. Black takes. There is no other move, since the white knight does target the bishop on e6. And here we take with the e-pawn. Now, it might look somewhat more natural to a lot of you to take with the bishop, and this is what I initially thought as well. However, the problem is that in this position, white doesn't actually have as much play compared to when we take over here, where we get the open e-file. And you'll see Sindarov using this very effectively. The rook goes to the newly opened file. Obviously, there's some x-ray pressure on the bishop, so we defend it. The rook goes to e3, black plays rook e8, and here we see pawn to h4. To quickly demonstrate the idea of taking on f4, here you have the option, for example, to play the move queen to e2. If black here does nothing, the threat here is bishop takes g7, king takes, rook takes e6, pawn h6, and here g3. This is maybe a bit of a strategic slip-up. How do I know this? Well, first of all, I can look at the e-file bar, as everyone in the YouTube chat has done during the live game. Amazing takes like S1100 I still have when I see such jokers. Clown emoji. This square really wants to be used for the rook. Maybe there's some pressure we can exercise here on that pawn. So not the most happy move to make. Pawn to a6, king to g2, bishop to f7. This is prophylaxis, like we talked about previously. There are scenarios where this bishop can be misplaced, so this always sort of gets out of the way. The queen goes to d2, allowing this rook to join the game more effectively, and bishop b4. And now the queen goes to e2. Now, this might leave a lot of you wondering, why didn't they go queen e2 in one go? And I will tell you, I have absolutely no idea. Bishop h5, pawn to a4. The bishop goes to a5. This is a more useful diagonal than this one. Pawn takes pawn, and bishop d1. And here, finally, we see a mistake. Black plays the move, bishop takes f3. Well, obviously, you don't want to give up the bishop pair, certainly for not reason. This spin is in existence, but in this scenario, it does kind of look like you're winning a pawn, because after bishop takes knight, queen takes knight, bishop to b6, and after a move like rook to a6, there's knight takes d4. If we take the knight, I simply take back. I'm hitting the rook. Rook moves away. We've won a pawn. However, this is just a pure miscalculation. Here after queen takes f3, bishop b6, rook a6, we do go for knight takes d4. Okay, the rook has pressure on the bishop, knight has pressure on the queen, and here's a really clever move, queen to h5. So I'm not gonna say that this is what was missed. I have no idea what was missed. Okay, what's happened in this position? Like I said, if we just take the knight over here and then exchange rooks, here it's very clearly black has won a pawn. This 3-on-4 isn't going anywhere, and this pawn position over here is gonna liquidate and end up with black having two connected passed pawns. Now, this is a draw because of the presence of the opposite color bishops. Instead, queen h5. And here black decided to sack the rook. Now, why did they do that? The bishop is hanging. What happens if we defend the bishop? Here there is rook to b6 anyway. Queen takes rook, and just calculate all the fours and lines. Bishop takes knight, queen takes knight, and rook takes e8. Uh-oh. But if we can't defend the bishop, then we have a huge problem, because we also can't retreat it. This is just checkmate after rook takes h6. Pawn takes h6, queen g6, and the queen has to block, and then it's made on the next move. So there's a lot of problems us in the position. Then we take back. Now white keeps the open file, gets some material, and has a clearly superior position. Black tries queen to c6. We take over here. We take back with the p-pawn. And here there is bishop to a4. All of white's pieces are certainly coming into play. And this game is going to end very quickly. Queen to c5. Queen to g6. Bishop a7. And now after rook a8 and the trade happens over here, king h7, we repeat once to get close to the time control. Both players are currently under time pressure. By move 40, they'll gain extra time. The bishop goes to d7, pawn to c3. We shuffle one more time, like I said, to reach time control. Here we're at move 40. Both players get an extra 30 minutes on the clock. And white ends the game spectacularly with the move rook to e6. And black resigns. Well, this is a rook sacrifice. Bishop takes e6. King goes to h8. Of course, if you go to f8, it's made on the move. Queen e8 check. King h7. Bishop f5. Pawn g6. Queen g6. King h8. And queen h7 is checkmate. If you do nothing, the threat is the immediate checkmate after rook to e8. So with the black king getting absolutely swarmed, the game is essentially over. Sindarov wins the first round against Esipenko. To make the video a bit shorter, I'll go over Blue versus Wayu a bit quicker. The game ended in a draw. Okay, next game, Pragnananda versus Giri. The game started with e4, c5, Sicilian defense, and knight c3. Here black plays d6. Now this tells me actually that most likely Giri, who has the black pieces, prepared the Najdorf defense. How come I know that? Well, after knight c3, usually in the closer Sicilian, or at least if you know that white is going to play the closer Sicilian with f4, black would like to play the move knight c6. Now here in the line, pawn g6, bishop b5, here you can play knight to d4. This is a known improvement over the move pawn to d6. A reason why you want to play this anyway is because after knight d6, white could decide, hey, I'm going to play knight f3. I'm just going to go back into a regular open Sicilian. We see the move pawn to f4. This is the Crown pre-attack, which is a line that at the top level is absolutely never played. Pawn g6, we will fianchetto, knight f3, bishop g7, and bishop b5. We have to block. Lots of ways to block this. If you block this with the move knight to c6, here we're going to simply take, and we're going to try a play against this slightly damaged pawn structure. So instead we block with the bishop, and here we play the move pawn to a4. Can you take this? It looks maybe interesting. Well, not really. We take back, and this is actually a structural improvement for the white pieces. We activate the rook, but more importantly, deprive black of a natural development square for the knight. So we don't see that. We see the move knight to c6, short castles, pawn a6. Are you gonna take me? If you do, I don't have to take back with my pawn. I can take back with my bishop. Instead, we go back. This loses some time though. Now we see e6, c3, and white here plays the move pawn to f5. Why are we giving up a pawn? This is just a temporary pawn sacrifice. We go queen to e1, which is a move preparing to swing the queen over to the king side, and bishop to e6. Now taking here is very much not worth it. White has a couple threats in this position. Let's say we do nothing. The threat here is to take. If black takes back, then we have this very, very annoying move, knight to g5. White coordinates on the f7 square. And you might be asking, wait, can we simply defend that while attacking the bishop? No, we can't. Here there's a very annoying move. Pawn to g4, absolutely brilliant. Well, if we take with the bishop, we simply open up the rook. Now we can take, and for the cost of one single pawn, the king is weak and all of black's pieces are super poorly coordinated. So here we see bishop to e6, simply closing up the diagonal. Take here, we can't take back with the bishop because we end up in the same scenario as the previous line. So instead we take back with the pawn, but now we trade over here and we win our material back. Queen goes to d7, queen c4, we don't want to trade queens, and black long castles. Bishop g5, rook e8, rook e1, knight to g6, and knight to d5. We are currently threatening a fork. Black steps out of the way and the knight goes to f6. Okay, this is a really strong bishop, but now that has to take itself away. We're currently forking over here, so we have to take and take back. The rook goes to f8, the bishop retreats back to c3, and pawn to f4. This allows an exchange on the e file and the move rook to e1. Ideally, you don't want to give up control of the only open file on the board. What are our attempts? Well, we could try the collinear move, rook to e3. However, here after this trade, this pawn is super weak. We can simply go something like king to f1, and if we try to bring a queen to e7, we go queen e4, and after the trade this pawn will simply fall. So that's not an idea. Well, can we trade either? Well, we can, absolutely, but there's no way to really take control of the file. After queen to e7, can go king f1, king c7, bishop c3. The white is just simply better here. So Anish decides to go rook to f8. This gives white control over the file. The queen goes to e6, the queen trade is accepted, and what are we doing? This rook looks super active. That ends, we have a slightly superior pawn structure. The king goes to c7, the knight goes to g5, and king d7. This is the main idea. White might have control over the open file, but if we can take away every infiltration spot, the file's not that effective anymore. Well, currently there's a threat in the position. If we do nothing, there's the move rook to f5. Both of these pieces are now hanging. We have to retreat, and black decides to play the move rook to f5 anyway, which gives up the pawn. Now you might be asking, what happens if we save the pawn? Well, here's a really funny computer line. Knight to h7, rook f5, knight f6, check, rook to e6, and if here we play the move knight to e7, simply we play the move king to f2, all of black's pieces are stuck. There's absolutely nothing to do. This rook cannot go anywhere. These knights are bound together. There's absolutely nothing to do for black. So the pawn can't be saved by pushing, so instead we play rook f5 and we give up the material. Black decides to go d5, the rook retreats, and d4. This bishop has a choice to make. We go back to e1, and here we see the move knight c to e5. The rook goes to e4. Black in this position has a threat to play f3. This prevents the move f3, because if you play it now, there's simply the move pawn to g4. Okay, the rook is kicked, and then needs to leave. The two connected passed pawns, along with black's very poorly coordinated pieces, will win white the game. We see knight to g4, pawn to h3, knight to e3. This pawn is hanging, so we need to push it. Knight to d5, pawn to h4. There was currently a threat of going rook to h5. This knight looks a little bit awkward over here, so we play pawn h4. D takes c, pawn takes back, rook h5. Now the knight can go to g5, and currently, Pragnananda has a lot of time left on the clock, but Anish with the black pieces needs to make 4 moves in 1 minute 45 seconds. That is not easy at all, and the position is really complicated. And black immediately goes on with the move knight to f6. Now you might be asking yourself, there's currently a pawn hanging. Can we go pawn grabbing? No. After the move knight to e6, this pawn is hit. We can defend. Apparently here the move pawn to c4 is really strong. The knight goes to b4, we grab on f4, and over here black's position is simply collapsing. So Anish decides to go knight f6 anyway. This is apparently even worse. Rook to e6. We take here, and rook to g4. Pawn h5, the knight has to move. Pawn h6. This passed pawn is a real problem. Anish plays knight f3 and finally reaches the time control. King decides to f1, we take back, and rook g2. What is happening in this position? Who is winning and why? This position, you might notice that material is equal. However, this passed pawn is a lot more annoying than this one. And what is worth noting is that this pawn over here is a huge weakness. At any moment, the white rook can swing over to b6, and black's position will simply collapse. Pawn is captured. The rook goes to h2. We simply drop back to defend. Rook h3. Now the king can activate. The rook gives a check. The king goes further up. Rook h3. King goes up. We can't keep giving checks. The king can simply hide over here. Pawn c4. Well, that's a free pawn, so we take it. They take back, and king goes to f5. You can't take over here, because h7 simply will win the game. Here, there's king g6. Honestly, what do? Let's say you wait. I just go here, and oops. Like I said, this pawn is always a weakness. We take now, and we simply push to h7. And black resigns. There's absolutely nothing to do. Alright, this next game. Fabiano with the white pieces, Hikaru with the black pieces. The game starts with a red here and transposes to the English opening after e6. Pawn g3, pawn d4. Usually you see stuff like knight f6. Maybe even pawn to c6, bishop g2, knight to c6, short castles, bishop c5, and pawn to e3. This is pretty uncommon. More normal here would be something like pawn to d3. It's kind of like a Benoni-esque structure, but with the colors reversed. As you can see, it's being played by some great players. Knight to e7, and here we see the move knight takes d4. Now, I think this is already a novelty, and you know what? I saw this happening, and I thought like, I never even contemplated this move. And it's a really nice tactic. Play the move pawn to b4. Now we end up with this nice little cluster in the center. Aha. Here, black decided to play the move castle. Now you might notice this pawn over here is hanging. What happens if you go pawn grabbing? Well, this simply is the move queen to a4 check, which picks up the bishop. Okay, bishop d7, you take over here. At the end of the line, you might notice that the rook is hanging. Now here, when I was going through the game myself, I figured, oh, something like bishop e2. And there's a bit of an issue. The king can't really go anywhere. After queen takes a2, which is the only way to get out, we could immediately take on g7 here. But also we can't castle, not only because of the threat over here, but also the knight is always hanging if the king moves away. We have to scrap this pawn over here. Yes, we're down the exchange, but this position is absolutely horrible for black. This king is unsafe forever. Turns out, bishop e2 isn't even necessary. What I saw with the engine here is that the move knight c3 is even better. Problem is the queen here will simply get trapped. The queen goes to b3, bishop to a5, and knight to c3. The knight goes to f5, bishop to a3. Here the move rook e8 was played, which I think, to someone who's clearly out of prep at this point, is a very normal, natural move. People in the live stream chat were going absolutely crazy, because there is the possibility here of the move knight to d4. And people were yelling, oh, this is gonna happen. This is absolutely gonna happen. Here, the computer gives the line queen to a4. The bishop is hanging. We're not gonna retreat over here. Pawn to c5 simply wins the game. Instead, we have to play the move pawn to b6. And you might notice both these rooks are just hanging. Either way you take doesn't matter. You play bishop to d7. The queen moves, take over here, and you take here. This is a double rook sacrifice. Now, there's some threats. For example, knight f3 is a threat. There's some attack on the light squares for sure. Here we have to move pawn to f3, and apparently this is a draw, and people thought this was gonna happen, and the only thing I have to say to that is, are you completely insane? Instead we see rook to e8, which I think is just way more normal. The pawn was of course hen in, so we push it. Knight to d4 anyway. Queen to a4, like we said previously, and here pawn to b6. Might be thinking like, hey, are we again hen in the material over here? Well, there's of course bishop takes a6. Still, you're not going to be able to take here. Queen takes back, and knight f3 is coming in. The attack on the light squares is coming in, and a really funny line here is that after the move pawn to f3, there is the move bishop g4. This is just really fun, isn't it? Instead, we see the move bishop to d7. The queen only has one retreat square left, but one is enough. Pawn to c5. Definitely don't want to take en passant. This would just allow these bishops to get traded, even though it is of course forged. Instead, we go bishop back to b2. The rook goes to b8. This is a plan to expand on the queen side. Pawn a4, pawn a6. Take on e6, and bishop takes back. Okay, there's pressure on this pawn over here. It might look natural here to play the move pawn to d3, simply defending the pawn. Over here, you have to move pawn to b5, and after the exchange is over here and we take, this position is kind of horrible. So instead, we have to play knight to d5 to solve our issues. And goes to d6. At this point, by the way, we're on move 20. Fabi's already in time trouble. It's 17 minutes for Fabi versus 38 for Hikaru. Fabi, will calculate it and evaluate it very precisely, decided to go for a series of exchanges over here, where eventually we end up in this endgame of opposite color bishops. Now, opposite color bishops are drawish. However, if more pieces than just the bishops, namely the queens, are on the board, they really favor the attacking side. Who is her attacking and why? Not immediately clear, but after pawn to h4, we're already threatening pawn h5, pawn h6, and we're going to try creating some weaknesses. Now, if black, miraculously, lands in a position where they get to go for this sort of pawn setup, they're completely fine. Apparently pawn g6 is completely playable. I'll be real honest with you, that is tricky to evaluate. And here pawn to h5 coming in. We cannot allow this pawn to go to h6, so we play pawn h6 ourselves, and rook to h1. The idea of this move is really clever. If, let's say we do nothing, we're gonna bring this rook from h1 to h4, the queen is gonna come here, and the rook is gonna come to f4. Coordinating on the weak f7 pawn gives white a really strong attack on the light squares. Then we see some minor shuffling over here. Here we're threatening infiltration with h7. You can't allow this. Is it obvious that white has made progress? Not immediately, but in this position there's a really sneaky tactic hidden. Rook takes f7. You might be thinking, oh, easy, we just take, we win the queen. No, we can block with the rook. However, what has changed in the position? The rook was a useful defender, and by taking this pawn away, we've essentially crippled black's pawn structure, and the light squares are weaker than they ever were before. We decide to go for queen e4. But wait a minute, I thought we didn't want to trade queens. This is a bit different. Our king is very active, and these two connected passes will win white the game. Bishop e7, pawn to e5, bishop e4. Bishop d3 and bishop e1. Some more moves were played, but these endgames are always a little bit complicated. King to d5, 4, on f6, and apparently it's a draw. And I just laughed to myself. The drawing move is king c7. King e7 was played, but okay. After this, the game eventually ended and black resigned. This pawn is just gonna promote. I went over the games a bit too quick. I understand this might not be your cup of tea. To be honest, I'm a one-man crew. I've never tried making daily videos before. So if you think you're not adding any value, listen, I get that. Leave a comment. Won't continue this as a series. If you really do like it and the video performs well, I could keep it up, but I would appreciate some feedback. YouTube thinks you like this video. Make sure to check it out, and I'll see you later. Bye bye.